I was inside my own home that afternoon, standing in the kitchen and listening to the quiet rhythm of a normal day, when the situation outside began to unfold without warning, because the HOA had decided that patience, context, and basic communication were unnecessary steps in whatever authority they believed they were about to exercise. The house was calm, and nothing about the moment suggested that conflict was approaching because there was no noise, no disruption, and no violation taking place that would justify attention, let alone escalation. Outside, the neighborhood looked the same as it always did, with cars parked neatly, lawns trimmed, and neighbors going about their routines without concern. That was when the HOA representative arrived. She stepped out of her vehicle with confidence that came not from understanding the situation, but from believing she already controlled it. She walked up the driveway slowly, deliberately, clipboard in hand, stopping just short of the front walkway as though she were claiming territory rather than addressing a homeowner. At first there was no knock. Instead, she stood there, scanning the property, making notes, filming short clips, and speaking loudly enough for nearby neighbors to hear, even though no one had engaged her yet. Her voice carried the tone of someone narrating a violation rather than attempting a conversation. A neighbor tried to approach her calmly and ask what the issue was, but she dismissed the question without turning her head, stating that enforcement was already in progress and that she did not need interference. Another neighbor suggested that whatever concern she had could be resolved with a simple conversation, but she waved that off as well, insisting that rules existed to be enforced, not discussed. Still, no one had come to the door. That was when she made the decision to escalate. She stepped back, pulled out her phone, and called the police. She spoke clearly and confidently, describing the situation as an active violation and requesting immediate assistance. She did not mention that no one had refused cooperation, because no one had been asked. She did not mention that the house was quiet, because silence did not support her narrative. She did not mention that neighbors had already attempted to explain that the situation did not require enforcement, because acknowledgement would have weakened her certainty. From inside the house, I heard none of this. I was still unaware that a complaint was being filed about my own property because the concept itself would have seemed absurd if someone had suggested it moments earlier. Nothing about the day indicated urgency or wrongdoing. Outside, the HOA representative remained planted at the edge of the driveway, arms crossed now, posture rigid, occasionally glancing at her phone as though waiting for reinforcements. Neighbors gathered quietly. Phones came out, not because anything dramatic had happened yet, but because everyone sensed that something unnecessary was being set in motion. When the patrol cars finally arrived, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The officers stepped out calmly, professional and neutral, and listened as the HOA representative launched into her explanation with renewed confidence, gesturing toward the house as though it were evidence itself. She spoke quickly, emphasizing authority, repetition, and urgency, convinced that the presence of uniforms meant her version of events would now become reality. The officers listened. They asked a few questions. They looked at the house. They looked at the neighbors. They did not rush. That pause alone unsettled her, because she had expected immediate action rather than verification. One of the officers asked whether the homeowner was aware of the complaint. She hesitated before answering. She admitted that no contact had been made yet, but insisted that enforcement required decisive action. The officers exchanged a glance and walked toward the front door. Inside, I heard the knock. It was calm and measured, not aggressive, and it carried the unmistakable professionalism of law enforcement performing due diligence rather than executing an order. I wiped my hands, walked to the door, and opened it without hesitation, because I had nothing to hide and no reason to be defensive. The moment the door opened, everything changed. The officers stopped mid-step, their posture shifted. Recognition crossed their faces before words ever did. The greeting they had prepared disappeared, replaced by a brief pause that communicated more than any explanation could have. They straightened instinctively, addressed me by title, and immediately recalibrated their approach. Outside, the HOA representative continued speaking, unaware that the dynamic had already collapsed. She was still explaining violations that no longer mattered, still gesturing toward imaginary authority that no longer applied, still confident that control was hers. The officers turned back toward her. Their tone changed. Their questions became specific. Their attention moved from accusation to verification. Her voice slowed. Her certainty faltered. She realized too late that the person who answered the door was not someone she could intimidate, dismiss, or pressure into compliance. She realized that the officers she had called were not there to enforce her assumptions, but to uphold the law. The neighbors watched silently as the shift became undeniable. What had begun as an attempt to exert control over a homeowner had transformed into a lesson about jurisdiction, authority, and restraint. The phones that had been raised in anticipation of drama now captured something quieter and far more powerful: accountability. The HOA representative stood frozen, holding her clipboard like a shield that no longer worked, as the officers calmly explained that no violation existed, no enforcement was warranted, and no further action would be taken. She attempted to interrupt. She attempted to justify. She attempted to reassert control. None of it mattered. The authority she believed she had summoned no longer belonged to her. And that was the moment she understood that calling the police does not guarantee power, especially when the truth is standing on the other side of the door. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you are watching from, and please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. After the initial shock passed and the door remained open, the situation settled into an uneasy pause that felt heavier than confrontation ever could. Because everyone present understood that the momentum had shifted, but no one yet knew how far the consequences would travel. The officers stepped slightly aside, positioning themselves in a way that was respectful rather than confrontational, while the HOA representative remained rooted near the edge of the driveway, still holding her clipboard but no longer using it with confidence. Her posture had changed subtly, with shoulders tightening and movements slowing, as though she were recalculating every decision she had made up to that point. Neighbors lingered nearby, no longer whispering but not speaking loudly either, because the tension had transformed into something observant rather than explosive. This was no longer a spectacle driven by emotion, but a process unfolding in real time, and people instinctively understood that this was a moment worth witnessing quietly. One of the officers asked for a brief clarification regarding the complaint that had been reported, not because the facts were unclear, but because procedure demanded a complete record. The HOA representative attempted to restate her claims, but the words did not land the way they had earlier. What once sounded assertive now sounded uncertain, because repetition without substance loses strength quickly when scrutiny replaces assumption. She explained that she had believed a rule violation was occurring, but when asked to specify which rule had been broken, her response lacked the certainty she had displayed before. She referenced general guidelines rather than specific clauses, and when pressed further, she defaulted to enforcement authority rather than documented cause. The officers listened patiently. They did not interrupt. They did not challenge her tone. They simply waited for clarity that never arrived. That waiting became its own form of pressure, because silence forces truth to surface or collapse. Without the ability to rely on urgency or intimidation, the HOA representative was left with only facts, and facts were not on her side. Inside the house, the quiet felt deliberate rather than accidental. I remained composed, not because the situation was amusing, but because it was familiar. Situations like this often reveal more about systems than individuals, and I recognized the signs of a process that had been allowed to operate without meaningful checks for far too long. One officer asked to review the original complaint details again, reading them carefully rather than scanning them quickly. The description, which had sounded dramatic when spoken aloud, appeared thin when examined line by line. There was no mention of refusal to cooperate, no documentation of prior warning, and no evidence of immediate risk. The gap between perception and reality widened. The HOA representative shifted her weight from one foot to the other, glancing toward the neighbors as though searching for support, but none came. The same people she had dismissed earlier were now witnesses, and their presence carried quiet authority of its own. A neighbor spoke up calmly, stating that no disturbance had occurred and that the situation could have been resolved with a conversation. Another neighbor confirmed that no warnings had been issued and that the HOA representative had arrived already, filming rather than communicating. These statements were noted, not dramatically, not emotionally, just carefully. The waiting continued. The officers stepped aside briefly to confer, maintaining professionalism while clearly reassessing the purpose of their presence. This was no longer a call requiring enforcement, but one requiring documentation and restraint. The distinction mattered. The HOA representative attempted to reinsert herself into the conversation, suggesting that even if no violation had occurred, the HOA still had the right to investigate. One of the officers acknowledged that investigation was permissible, but enforcement without cause was not. That clarification landed heavily. For the first time, the HOA representative was forced to confront the reality that authority has boundaries and that crossing them transforms oversight into overreach. The confidence that had carried her through the earlier moments had evaporated, replaced by visible discomfort. The waiting was no longer about outcome. It was about realization. People waited not for action, but for understanding to catch up. The officer returned to the porch and explained calmly that no further action would be taken, that the complaint lacked sufficient grounds, and that the situation would be documented as resolved without enforcement. The explanation was clear, measured, and final. The HOA representative stood silently. She did not argue. She did not object. She simply nodded, once, slowly, as though absorbing something she had never expected to hear. Around her, the neighborhood remained quiet. No one celebrated. No one jeered. The moment did not call for reaction. It called for reflection. The patrol cars remained parked for a few more minutes, not out of necessity, but to ensure the situation concluded without further escalation. That pause served as a boundary, marking the end of authority exercised and the beginning of authority examined. The HOA representative eventually turned and walked back toward her vehicle, her movements careful, her earlier urgency completely gone. She did not film. She did not speak. She did not look back. Neighbors slowly dispersed, conversations resuming in low tones as people returned to their routines with a shared understanding that something important had occurred. Inside the house, the quiet returned, but it felt different than before. It was no longer the quiet of an ordinary day, but the quiet that follows a correction. When systems have been tested and found wanting, the waiting was over, but the consequences were just beginning. The arrival of the police marked the moment when assumptions met structure, because authority without verification often feels powerful until it encounters a process that cannot be rushed or bent by confidence alone. The patrol cars had approached the neighborhood quietly, without sirens or urgency, which immediately contradicted the picture that had been painted by the call itself. Their presence did not signal crisis or danger, but procedure, and that difference alone began to expose the gap between the report that had been made and the reality that existed on the ground. When the officers stepped out of their vehicles, their movements were measured and calm, shaped by training that prioritized observation before action. They did not scan for threats or raise the eye. Our voices. They looked around first, taking in the condition of the property, the posture of the people present, and the absence of any visible disruption. The HOA representative approached them quickly, eager to reclaim the momentum she believed the uniforms would provide. She spoke first, framing the situation as an active violation that required enforcement, emphasizing her authority, and repeating the word non-compliance. As though repetition alone could make it true, the officers listened without interrupting. They asked her to slow down. They asked for clarification. They asked for specifics. Each question was simple, but together they formed a structure that demanded substance rather than certainty. As the conversation continued, it became increasingly clear that what had been presented as an urgent issue was built almost entirely on assumption. The HOA representative gestured toward the house repeatedly, speaking about rules and expectations, but when asked whether any warnings had been issued or any conversations attempted, she admitted that no direct contact had been made prior to the call. That admission mattered. The officers noted it quietly. They then asked whether the homeowner had refused access, refused compliance, or created a disturbance. The answer was no. They asked whether there was any immediate risk to safety or property. The answer was no. With each response, the justification for enforcement narrowed until it was almost non-existent. What remained was a belief in authority rather than evidence of violation. The officers shifted their attention toward the house, not as a target, but as a necessary part of due process. One of them explained calmly that they would need to speak directly with the homeowner to understand the situation fully. The HOA representative objected, stating that enforcement was already underway, but the officer clarified that law enforcement does not enforce HOA rules, and that their role was limited to verifying whether any laws had been broken. That distinction was critical. It reframed the entire situation. As the officers walked toward the front door, their pace was steady and deliberate. They were not responding to a threat, but to a report that required confirmation. Their posture reflected professionalism rather than confrontation, and teach alone began to unravel the narrative the HOA representative had constructed. Neighbors watched closely. Some stood on their porches, others leaned against fences. Phones were still visible, but they were no longer recording chaos, they were recording process. The knock on the door was firm but respectful, signaling presence rather than dominance. It was the sound of procedure asserting itself quietly, without spectacle. When the door opened, the shift was immediate. The officers recognized me instantly, not because of uniform or insignia, but because familiarity changes dynamics faster than authority ever could. Their expressions changed subtly, their posture straightened, and the tone they had prepared dissolved into professional acknowledgement. They addressed me properly. They stepped back slightly. They recalibrated. That moment did not involve raised voices or dramatic reactions, but it carried weight precisely because of its restraint. The officers did not need to say anything aloud for the shift to be visible. It was written in their body language, their choice of words, and the way they now framed their questions. Outside, the HOA representative continued speaking, unaware at first that the situation had already moved beyond her control. She repeated her claims, gesturing toward the house, but the officers no longer responded to her urgency. Their attention was now focused on verification rather than accusation. One officer explained the nature of the complaint, calmly, outlining what had been reported and what had not. The explanation was neutral and factual, stripped of the drama that had accompanied the call. I listened. I responded. I clarified. Documents were referenced, context was provided, and the absence of any violation became increasingly obvious with every exchanged sentence. The conversation was calm, efficient, and grounded in reality. The OFIC. Ears asked whether there had been any refusal to cooperate. There had not. They asked whether any prior notice had been given. There had not. They asked whether any law had been broken. There had not. With each answer, the reason for their presence diminished, further, until it became clear that the call itself had been unnecessary from the beginning. The HOA representative finally realized that something was wrong. Her voice slowed. Her words lost momentum. She noticed the change in posture, the shift in tone, and the way the officers were no longer responding to her with deference or urgency. The authority she believed she had summoned was no longer aligned with her expectations. One of the officers turned toward her and explained, clearly and professionally, that no enforcement action would be taken, because no violation existed that fell within law enforcement jurisdiction. The explanation was calm, but firm, leaving no room for reinterpretation. She attempted to object, stating that the HOA still had authority. But the officer clarified again that HOA authority does not extend to police enforcement without a legal basis. That clarification ended the debate. The power dynamic that had fueled the escalation dissolved quietly, replaced by the reality of boundaries and process. The uniforms no longer represented leverage for the HOA, but a reminder that authority must align with law. The neighbors observed the exchange without comment, because nothing more needed to be said. The outcome was clear not because someone won an argument, but because the facts had spoken for themselves. The officers documented the interaction, noting the lack of violation and the unnecessary escalation. They did not lecture, they did not threaten, they simply recorded the truth. As they prepared to leave, one officer reiterated that future concerns should be addressed through communication rather than escalation, and that law enforcement resources should not be used to enforce private rules. The message was delivered calmly, it was unmistakable. The patrol cars pulled away moments later, leaving behind a driveway that felt suddenly quiet and a neighborhood that had just witnessed the limits of assumed authority. The police arrival had not produced the outcome the HOA representative expected. Instead, it had produced clarity, and clarity, once introduced, cannot be undone. Recognition did not arrive all at once, because realization rarely does, and instead it unfolded gradually as the meaning of the moment began to settle into the expressions, posture, and silence of everyone still standing in the driveway. After the officers finished documenting the interaction and clarified that no enforcement action would be taken, they remained present for a brief moment longer, not out of necessity but out of professionalism. Their presence now served a different purpose. It marked the boundary between what had been attempted and what had actually occurred. The HOA representative stood quietly near her vehicle, still holding the clipboard that had once given her confidence. She no longer used it. It hung loosely at her side, no longer a tool of authority, but a reminder of how quickly certainty can dissolve when it is not supported by facts. The neighbors had not dispersed yet. They stayed because they understood that this was not simply the end of a disagreement, but the beginning of something else. People sense when a moment carries consequences beyond itself. And this was one of those moments. One of the officers addressed me directly, speaking in a low, respectful tone that reflected familiarity and acknowledgement rather than formality. The words themselves were not dramatic, but the way they were delivered made their meaning unmistakable. This was not a routine interaction. This was recognition. That recognition did not elevate the situation emotionally, it grounded it. The conversation shifted away from defense and explanation and moved instead toward closure and understanding. The officers confirmed what was already clear, that the call should never have been made and that the escalation had been unnecessary from the beginning. Outside, the HOA representative listened without interruption. This alone marked a significant change. Earlier, she had spoken over neighbors, dismissed questions, and asserted authority without hesitation. Now, she remained silent, absorbing the reality that the narrative she had constructed had collapsed under even minimal scrutiny. The recognition was not limited to titles or roles. It extended to responsibility. One of the officers explained that the incident would be noted internally, not as a complaint against anyone, but as a documented misuse of emergency resources. The explanation was calm and procedural, stripped of judgment, but firm in its implication. This was not about punishment. It was about record. Records matter. They create accountability long after the moment itself has passed. The HOA representative nodded slowly, understanding that this interaction would not simply disappear once she drove away. It would follow procedure. It would exist in writing. It would shape future responses. Recognition has weight because it changes what comes next. A neighbor spoke quietly, thanking the officers for handling the situation professionally. The comment was simple, but it reflected the collective relief of people who had expected chaos and instead witnessed restraint. Another neighbor mentioned that situations like this had happened before. Though not always with witnesses or documentation, the officer listened carefully and encouraged anyone with concerns to use proper channels rather than allowing intimidation to become normalized. That statement resonated. It acknowledged a pattern without accusing individuals. It validated experiences without inflaming them. The HOA representative shifted again, clearly aware now that the scope of the situation extended beyond this single address. What she had treated as routine enforcement had been revealed as part of a broader issue. Recognition is uncomfortable when it exposes habits rather than mistakes. The officers returned to their vehicles shortly after, leaving behind a quiet that felt different from the calm that had existed before the incident. This quiet was heavier, shaped by understanding rather than ignorance. As the patrol cars disappeared down the street, the HOA representative remained for a moment longer, standing beside her vehicle as though uncertain what to do next. The confidence that had brought her there no longer guided her movements. She finally approached and spoke, not with authority but with caution. Her words were measured, her tone was restrained. She acknowledged that the situation had escalated unnecessarily and stated that she would report back to the HOA board. The statement lacked apology, but it did not need one to signal change. Recognition had already occurred. She left shortly after, driving away without filming, without commentary, and without looking back. The departure was quiet, unremarkable, and final. Neighbors slowly returned to their homes, conversations resuming in subdued tones. There was no celebration, there was no sense of victory, there was only the shared understanding that something had shifted. Inside the house, the stillness felt earned. The door closed gently, not to shut out the world, but to restore normalcy. The events replayed in the mind not as a confrontation, but as a lesson in how systems respond when challenged by reality. Recognition does not always come with consequences immediately visible. Sometimes it plants itself quietly in records, conversations, and decisions that unfold later. That afternoon marked the moment when unchecked authority encountered verification and could not proceed unchanged. The recognition that followed was not personal, it was structural. The HOA representative recognized the limits of her role. The officers reinforced the boundaries of law. The neighbors recognized their collective voice, and the system, for perhaps the first time in a long while, was forced to look at itself without assumption. Recognition had arrived, and once it does, it cannot be undone. The silence did not arrive abruptly, because silence of this kind never does, and instead it spread slowly through the space left behind when certainty collapses and no one is quite sure what to say next. After the HOA representative drove away, The driveway remained empty, but the absence felt heavier than her presence ever had. The place where she had stood moments earlier now held nothing but still air. And yet everyone who had witnessed the exchange could feel that something irreversible had just occurred. This was not the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of consequence. Neighbors lingered for several minutes longer than usual, standing in small clusters or remaining on their porches without speaking much, because people instinctively understand when a moment deserves reflection rather than reaction. There was no excitement in the air, no relief loud enough to celebrate, and no anger left to release. What remained was awareness. The quiet made room for it. One neighbor eventually broke the silence by commenting softly that they had never seen an HOA representative leave without finishing a sentence. The observation was not meant to mock, but to acknowledge how unusual the moment had been. Others nodded in agreement, recognizing that they had all just watched authority retreat without resistance. Another neighbor mentioned that the neighborhood felt different already. Though nothing physical had changed, the houses were the same, the roads were the same, the rules were still written somewhere. What had changed was the understanding of how those rules could and could not be used. Silence clarifies things that noise obscures. Inside the house, the stillness carried a similar weight. The door was closed, the locks unchanged, and the walls held the same quiet they always had, but the feeling was different. The house no longer felt like a place that had been inspected or judged. It felt restored to its rightful state of privacy. I stood for a moment without moving, not because I was unsettled, but because moments like this deserve to be acknowledged internally. This was not about pride or validation. It was about recognizing how quickly a situation can spiral when authority operates without restraint, and how quickly it can stop when process re-enters the equation. The phone remained silent. No follow-up calls came immediately. No messages arrived demanding explanation. That silence mattered because it indicated hesitation where certainty had once lived. Outside, neighbors began returning to their routines gradually. One by one, doors closed, porches emptied, and the neighborhood resumed its normal rhythm. Yet beneath that normalcy, something fundamental had shifted. People now knew where the limits were. They had seen them enforced calmly. The silence extended beyond the driveway and into the broader structure of the HOA itself. That afternoon passed without any notices being posted, any emails being sent, or any further attempts to assert authority. The usual stream of enforcement communications simply stopped. For the first time in a long while, the HOA said nothing. That absence spoke louder than any notice ever had. Later that evening, conversations resumed quietly among neighbors, not in groups but in pairs and private messages. People compared experiences, recalling moments when they had felt pressured, dismissed, or intimidated by enforcement that relied more on confidence than clarity. What surprised many was how similar those experiences sounded. Silence creates space for stories. Stories reveal patterns, and patterns demand attention. The HOA board did not respond publicly that day, nor the next, nor the day after. The lack of immediate reaction was not accidental. It was caution. Once authority is challenged publicly and documented, every response must be deliberate. Silence became strategy. Inside the organization, questions were being asked. How had the situation escalated so quickly? Why had law enforcement been called without verification? Why had neighbors been ignored? Why had no prior contact been made? Those questions did not come with easy answers, and until they were addressed, silence was safer than speech. Residents noticed. The usual sense of looming oversight faded noticeably. People walked their properties without the familiar tension of being watched. Conversations with neighbors felt lighter, less guarded. The invisible pressure that had once accompanied compliance eased. Silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes it means recalibration. Several days later, an email arrived from the HOA board, brief and carefully worded. It did not reference the incident directly. It did not assign blame. It stated only that enforcement procedures were under review and that residents would be notified of any updates once the review was complete. The message was neutral, but neutrality itself was new. The HOA representative at the center of the incident remained absent. Her name did not appear in communications. Her presence was no seen. Her authority, once exercised freely, was now suspended by silence. That absence confirmed what everyone already understood. Something had ended. Silence settled into a pattern rather than a pause. Enforcement vehicles were not seen for several days. Notices did not appear. Complaints went unanswered while procedures were examined. Some residents found the quiet unsettling at first because they had grown accustomed to constant oversight. Others found it liberating. All of them noticed the silence was not empty, it was corrective. Inside the house, life returned to its normal rhythm. Meals were cooked, lights were turned on and off, doors opened and closed. Nothing about daily life needed to change because the home had never been out of order to begin with. That was the point. The silence allowed that truth to settle. The confrontation had ended not with force, but with restraint. Authority had not been seized. It had been examined and found wanting in its unchecked form. Silence marked the boundary between misuse and correction. It gave everyone involved time to understand what had happened without defensiveness or denial. It removed the need for immediate reaction and replaced it with reflection. And in that reflection, the system began to adjust. The sudden silence was not a void, it was a reset. The lesson did not arrive as a statement or a verdict, because lessons that last rarely do, and instead it unfolded quietly over time as behavior changed, expectations adjusted, and the system corrected itself without needing to be forced again. In the days following the sudden silence, the neighborhood continued to function as it always had on the surface, with people leaving for work, returning home in the evenings and maintaining their routines. But beneath that surface there was a shared awareness that something fundamental had shifted. The community, no lawn. Jer felt subject to an invisible pressure that could materialize at any moment without explanation. The HOA board eventually followed up with a more detailed communication, and the tone of that message confirmed what many residents already suspected. The language was careful, measured, and procedural, emphasizing review, accountability, and the importance of proper process. There was no defensiveness, and no attempt to minimize what had occurred. That alone signaled change. The board explained that enforcement procedures were being rewritten to ensure that communication came before escalation, that documentation came before assumption, and that law enforcement involvement would be limited strictly to situations involving actual legal concern. These were not revolutionary ideas, but the fact that they had to be stated explicitly revealed how far the system had drifted from its original purpose. The lesson was not about one individual making a poor decision. It was about what happens when authority operates without restraint. Residents noticed immediate differences in how issues were handled. Questions were answered directly rather than deflected. Concerns were acknowledged instead of dismissed. Enforcement representatives, when they appeared at all, introduced themselves, explained their purpose clearly, and listened before speaking. The power dynamic had shifted permanently. It no longer flowed in only one direction. The HOA representative who had initiated the incident did not return to enforcement duties. There was no announcement explaining her absence, but no one needed one. Her role had been incompatible with the new expectations, and the system had corrected accordingly. That outcome was not celebrated. It was accepted, because accountability is not about spectacle. It is about alignment. The neighborhood meetings that followed were quieter and more productive. And they had been in years. People spoke openly about boundaries, rights, and responsibilities without fear of reprisal. The board listened more than it spoke. When disagreements arose, they were addressed through discussion rather than enforcement. The lesson was settling into practice. Inside the home, life continued without disruption. The house felt the same as it always had, but the sense of security felt deeper now, not because authority had been asserted, but because it had been properly constrained. The home existed as it should, protected by law rather than subjected to oversight masquerading as power. Neighbors who had once avoided HOA involvement now participated cautiously, encouraged by the transparency they had witnessed. Others who had remained silent for years finally shared their experiences, not to reopen wounds, but to ensure they would not be repeated. The lesson extended beyond the HOA itself. It reached into how people understood authority in general. They saw that uniforms do not replace facts. They saw that confidence does not equal correctness. They saw that systems only function properly when accountability is built into them. Law enforcement had not resolved the situation by force or intimidation. They had resolved it by refusing to act without cause, by respecting boundaries, and by documenting truth rather than narratives. That example mattered. It reinforced the idea that the rule of law protects everyone, including those who might otherwise be targeted by overreach. It showed that professionalism is measured not by how quickly authority is exercised, but by how carefully it is restrained. The lesson was not dramatic, it was durable. Months later, the incident was rarely mentioned, not because it was forgotten, but because it had been integrated into how the community operated. It no longer needed to be discussed because its effects were visible in daily interactions and procedural clarity. The HOA functioned more quietly now, not because it was weaker, but because it was more precise. Enforcement was rare. Communication was frequent. Escalation became the exception rather than the default. That balance created stability. Standing on the porch one evening, watching the neighborhood settle into twilight, it was clear that the most meaningful outcome of the entire situation was not embarrassment or reversal, but correction. The system had been tested, exposed, and adjusted without breaking. The lesson had been learned by everyone involved. Authority must answer to process, rules must be applied with context, power must be accountable, and silence, when used correctly, can be a sign of health rather than avoidance. The neighborhood moved forward with a clearer understanding of its boundaries and its rights, and that understanding became the foundation for a more respectful community. The situation ended not with confrontation, but with clarity, and that clarity endured.